Ready? Thank you. Good afternoon. Today, I am very proud to be here to discuss a very important new piece of legislation for Newfoundland and Labrador, an act respecting accessibility in the province, referred to as the Accessibility Act. As a government, we are strongly committed to delivering provincial accessibility legislation to create a more accessible and inclusive province that will apply to all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. In fact, my mandate letter from the Premier clearly states that I and my department will work across government and with stakeholders to lead the development of provincial accessibility legislation to help ensure equitable access to services and opportunities for people with disabilities. And today, I am meeting this key commitment. When we as a province improve accessibility and inclusion, all persons in Newfoundland and Labrador benefit. This ultimately leads to everyone being able to fully participate in society. Nearly 1 in 4 Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are disabled by barriers. These barriers can be physical, attitudinal, or systemic. As well, an act, a regulation, a policy, a technology, or a business practice can also prevent full participation in society. It is extremely important to remove barriers as it helps to make the province more inclusive and accessible, which benefits everyone. It helps improve a person's health and well-being when they can fully participate in their community, and communities and businesses benefit from this engagement. Further, the purchasing power of people with disabilities has been estimated by the Royal Bank of Canada to be roughly $25 billion nationally, and that, in terms of Newfoundland context, would be roughly $30 million in economic activity. To get us to this point today, we partner with the Provincial Advisory Council for the Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities and the Coalition of Persons with Disabilities Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as government's Public Engagement and Planning Division, to develop and deliver an extensive engagement process. Throughout the entire engagement process, we heard repeatedly and consistently from the community of persons with disabilities and key stakeholders that we need a made in Newfoundland and Labrador's approach to accessibility legislation, and we need to get it right. And that is exactly what we have done, while fully supporting the philosophy of nothing about us without us. There are many people and organizations that I would like to thank for being engaged in the development of this proposed legislation. Of course, you run the risk of leaving someone out when you begin listing groups, but I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the important role of the disability community, and specifically the Provincial Advisory Council for Persons with Disabilities and the Coalition for Persons with Disabilities Newfoundland and Labrador. The commitment, passion, and patience of so many in this community to ensure this was done right, I believe, has led to the development of a very strong piece of legislation. So too, we have appreciated our engagement with the business community. Certainly, over the last year or more, businesses have come and continue to experience challenges due to the COVID-19 global pandemic. But many businesses have also found opportunities to reach customers and clients by expanding their products and services with the use of accessible and different technology features, from offering online ordering and deliveries to curbside pickup. These additional options have directly helped to expand their businesses to reach so many individuals and so many more individuals. Now, as businesses continue to look forward to ways to expand their reach, they are already advancing accessibility and inclusion throughout the province. So let's all take a moment to ask why. Why are we advancing accessibility now? The answer is simple. It is the right thing to do. Everyone, and I mean everyone, deserves to participate equitably in society without barriers in a province that promotes itself as being inclusive and accessible. The proposed Accessibility Act, which I would describe as enabling legislation, is a bill that will allow government to outline the principles and goals for an accessible Newfoundland and Labrador. Enabling legislation allows for further development of associated regulations and policies rather than prescribing specific requirements in the legislation today. It provides a broad focus on areas of authority that government can act on in the future. The purpose of this bill is to improve accessibility by preventing, identifying, and removing barriers that prevent persons with disabilities from full participation in society. The proposed bill would authorize the establishment of accessibility standards to improve accessibility, establish an advisory board to make recommendations to me as minister responsible for the status of persons with disabilities regarding these accessibility standards, require an individual, organization, or public body that is subject to an accessibility standard to take actions to prevent barriers from being created and to identify and remove those barriers. Require public bodies to prepare accessibility plans for every 3 years and make them publicly available, and provide inspection and enforcement powers to enforce accessibility standards once they are in place. As a province, this proposed accessibility legislation would allow us to join 5 other provinces: British Columbia, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec, as well as the federal government, in having such legislation focused specifically on advancing accessibility and inclusion. It would also embrace the principles, and I think this is very important, from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Commonwealth Parliamentarians with the Disabilities Network, the Canadian Human Rights Act, and the Newfoundland and Labrador Human Rights Act. It has been said to me on numerous occasions by the community of and for persons with disabilities that the passing of this accessibility legislation will be the next critical step in advancing accessibility and inclusion in Newfoundland and Labrador. That is why I would like to highlight that every December 3rd, we come together to join persons with disabilities around the world in celebration of the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. The annual observance of this day was proclaimed in 1992 by the United Nations. The observance of this day aims to promote an understanding of disability issues and to mobilize support for the dignity, rights, and well-being of persons with disabilities. It is my goal that the Made in Newfoundland and Labrador accessibility legislation be proclaimed on December 3rd to help further advance and ensure the accessibility inclusions of all persons throughout the province. Thank you, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Minister Abbott. For the benefit of the Minister and listeners, we have 2 media in person and 1 joining by phone. There will be 2 rounds in the question and answer period, which will give each reporter the opportunity to ask 1 question and 1 follow-up per round. Our first questions are from Ben Cleary with NTV News. Please go ahead and make your way to the mic.
Hi, thank you, Minister. So my first question is just if this bill does come into force in early December, how will this help people immediately or persons with disabilities? Will this help them right away?
And Ben, thank you for the question. What this legislation does, and I refer to as enabling legislation, it now sets up the legal framework to advance accessibility standards and enforcement mechanisms from here on in. We've got a lot of work to do, and this is really step 1 to what will be a very comprehensive process to put in standards, whether it's for customer service, communications, education, built environment. So this is it's the essential building block to allow us, the government, to do this and to engage the business community, the disability community, and others to make sure we get it right.
And this legislation is about, I think, preventing and identifying barriers within the community. What are some of the common barriers that exist in Newfoundland and Labrador right now?
Well, you can look at the built environment in terms of access to any public space. And though we have legislation in place, we still know there are barriers there. We have barriers when it comes to use of the web and the internet in relaying basic information. We have barriers when you go to shop in a store. So we have them throughout our society, all sectors, and what we will be doing as a government, lead by example. So we will be developing disability plans, accessibility plans to address the barriers that we would have in government and make sure we deal with those in the first instance. We'll be working with the business community and others to make sure we address those barriers. But it will all be done in tandem and it will include persons with disabilities to make sure that they are active in the process, guiding the process, and as we said, nothing will be done without them, in making sure we move this forward.
Thank you.
Our second questions are from Richard Duggan with VOCM. Please go ahead and make your way to the mic.
Thank you. Minister, this legislation that's being announced today is all about where government hopes to go in terms of accessibility. How do you think the province is doing as a whole right now in terms of accessibility, and how does this factor into where you want to go?
Well, based on the evidence and the literature, and when we compare ourselves to other jurisdictions, we have a long distance to go, and that's recognized. Now, we have our Provincial Advisory Council that has been working very closely with us, and they've been in place for quite a number of years, but they have identified this as sort of their priority, and they wanted to make it its governance priority, which we've done. There's a lot of work to be done, and there is no doubt on a daily basis, I know people with any type of physical and intellectual disability are facing barriers. This is the opportunity now to identify those and to start to remove them.
And you mentioned that I believe there's 5 other provinces with such legislation in place. Yeah. When you were looking at those, what did you learn from how those provinces are dealing with this, and what are you taking from that?
What we learned is it's going to take a lot of effort to make sure that we can build an accessible and inclusive province. Within that, identifying and creating those standards is going to take time and effort. But we can learn from those provinces, whether it's Manitoba, who has some standards in place, so we can learn from those. So I'm hoping we can allow it, which will allow us to accelerate our timeframes. We see in Nova Scotia just put out their annual report, and it's a great template for us to use. So again, we can learn from that. So we should be able to accelerate some of the work that we want to do here in this province based on their experience to date.
Thank you. Our third questions are from Glenn Whiffen with the Telegram as we go to the phone.
Thank you, Minister, for taking our questions today. I'm just wondering if this legislation passes and is implemented on December the 3rd, how soon do you expect to have an Accessibility Standards Advisory Board in place?
Well, that would be truly our first order of priority, and we will be getting onto that immediately. So we would have the Independent Appointments Commission, and then with their recommendations to the department, then back to Cabinet for final approval. So that's going to, I would assume, will take a couple of months, but I would aim that we'll be certainly up and running by the spring.
And this bill will require public bodies, is what it says, to prepare accessibility plans. How does that filter over to the private businesses and groups?
The difference there is that because, as I said a few minutes ago, we want to lead by example, so we can, as a government, insist that our departments and agencies will build these plans. When it comes to the private sector, it will be based on the standards we develop in consultation with them. So using customer service as an example, that we would work with the private sector, persons with disabilities, and the larger community to identify those standards, engage the business community, and then once that process is completed, make a recommendation from the Accessibility Board to me, then to the Cabinet for final approval and then implementation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's our first round of questions. We'll go to the second round of questions, if there's any. Ben Cleary with NTV News. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I guess I know it's very early in the process, but speaking of the private sector, will there be any kind of financial assistance made available to businesses as they try to remove these barriers?
We haven't contemplated that yet, but that being said, in the legislation, there is a provision for government to provide incentives to business and others to comply with the standard. What form that will take, whether it will be financial, tax, or other, that will be determined as we develop that standard. So we would work with the business community and say, look, if we adopt that standard, what is it going to take for you to implement? And then if there needs to be an incentive, then we will work on that with them.
Thank you.
And Richard Duggan with VOCM, do you have a question?
Yes, more to what you just mentioned there. What sort of penalties will be in place for non-compliance?
The legislation contemplates financial penalties. Now, again, that's way down the track. We don't know of any jurisdiction that's invoked that to this point in time, and it would be something we would obviously prefer not to go there. But if we have to, the legislation will clearly outline what those penalties can be for the individual and/or business, and they will also be spelled out in regulation once they're developed.
And do I get a second question?
Yes, you can do a follow-up.
Okay. And from what you heard from those in the business community, I guess what sort of want is there from the business community to help eliminate these barriers for people?
You know, I'll be honest, I was pleasantly surprised by how receptive the business community, in terms of their representatives were in our discussions with them as late as Friday passed. So they recognize that there's a need here, societal need, to address this. So give full credit. But they also recognize for their businesses, as our society is aging, there are more persons with disabilities in any event. Our aging demographic would suggest there's going to be more potential barriers in place for mobility, those kinds of things. So they recognize that there's a business need and opportunity here, and that government is not going to ram this down their throats, as it were. They're going to be working. We're going to be working together to solve those barriers, and then make sure that new businesses, as they come on, will already have put those in their business plans, and there won't be any surprises in the future.
Glenn Whiffen with the Telegram, do you have a question?
Yes. I understand there was extensive consultations prior to this legislation. Just wondering, was there anything identified, like any standards identified particularly during the consultations that individuals or groups are eager to get working on?
Not specifically any specific standard. What people are interested in right across the board is that we get on with this legislation, and that we put in the processes to get that framework in place, and so that the community, whether you're from the disabled community, the business community, the nonprofit community, or in the public sector community, know what the rules of quote-unquote engagement will be on this. The legislation now clearly spells out what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, and basically when we're going to do it. And that lends certainty, and there will be no surprises for anybody going forward. The challenge will be to the Accessibility Advisory Board and to government to get these standards up and running as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Minister, do you have any final comments for today?
No, it's going to be a great day. I think for people in the community who have been looking for this for quite a long time, and I think we worked hard to get it right, and obviously we'll know once we get into the debate if in fact we've got it right. So I'm looking forward to the debate starting this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Stay safe, everyone. Take care of yourselves and each other, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Michelle.